Every morning looked the same. The men lined up, moved on time, and followed routines no one questioned. Yet beneath that surface order, something important was missing. Discipline had already faded, authority no longer pressed in, and no one demanded precision anymore. Still, the routine continued, not because it was enforced, but because stopping it felt harder than keeping it alive. For a long time, routine had been inseparable from authority. The men did not question why they lined up, why they moved when they did, or why their days unfolded in a fixed order. Routine had been reinforced by discipline, and discipline by consequence. Inside the camp, structure once existed because it was required, observed, and corrected. When discipline began to fade, routine did not disappear with it. The men still woke at the same hours. They still gathered in familiar places. Tasks still followed a recognizable sequence. From the outside, little appeared to have changed. Yet the force that once sustained this order had quietly withdrawn, leaving routine to exist on its own. At first, the continuation of routine felt reassuring. Familiar patterns offered stability in an environment where enforcement had become uncertain. The men followed schedules not because anyone demanded it, but because routine reduced decision-making. It told them where to be and when, sparing them the effort of choice in a world that had already taken much from them. Without authority pressing down, routine began to take on a different character. It was no longer something imposed from above. It became something maintained from within. The men carried it forward through habit rather than obligation. What had once been a system of control transformed into a mechanism of endurance. This transformation altered how effort was experienced. Previously, precision had been necessary. Now, adequacy was enough. Tasks were completed to maintain continuity, not excellence. Movement remained coordinated, but less exact. The goal shifted from correctness to flow. As long as the day moved forward without disruption, routine felt successful. Emotionally, this shift produced a quiet detachment. The men no longer associated routine with pressure or fear. They also did not associate it with purpose. Routine became neutral, a background rhythm that carried them through hours without asking questions. It filled time without demanding meaning. The absence of authority made this neutrality possible. Without enforcement, routine did not threaten. It also did not protect. It simply existed. The men did not feel controlled by it, nor did they feel empowered by following it. They followed it because it was there, and because altering it would require energy they preferred to conserve. Socially, routine became a shared refuge. Even as discipline weakened, moving together offered a sense of continuity. Shared timing reduced uncertainty. Doing the same things at the same moments created a quiet alignment, even when belief in the system had faded. Routine allowed the group to remain synchronized without needing agreement. The guards, still present but distant, did not intervene in this transformation. Their lack of involvement confirmed what the men already sensed. Routine was no longer being evaluated. It did not need to be perfect. It only needed to exist. This absence of scrutiny allowed routine to persist without pressure. Over time, the men stopped associating routine with authority altogether. It became separate from enforcement, detached from expectation. Routine survived because it required less effort than change. In an environment where energy was limited and outcomes were uncertain, maintaining familiar patterns felt safer than inventing new ones. By the end of this stage, routine had become self-sustaining. It no longer relied on discipline, punishment, or correction. It endured because it simplified life. The men continued to line up, move on time, and follow the same paths through the camp, not because they were ordered to, but because routine had become the easiest way to move through days that no longer demanded obedience. This marked the beginning of a new phase. Authority had faded. Discipline had thinned. Yet routine remained, carrying the men forward through repetition alone. And as long as routine continued, the absence of enforcement did not feel urgent. It simply became part of how life inside the camp was lived quietly and without resistance. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As routine continued without authority, it began to take on a new role. It no longer followed discipline. It replaced decision itself. The men did not ask whether to act. They asked only when the next familiar movement would occur. Routine stopped organizing the day around purpose and instead organized the mind around repetition. In earlier stages of captivity, routine had been a response to instruction. Each action answered an expectation. Now, expectation no longer arrived, yet the actions remained. The men followed sequences without considering alternatives, not because alternatives were forbidden, but because they felt unnecessary. Choice had become an interruption rather than an opportunity. This shift reduced cognitive strain. In a world stripped of clarity, routine offered predictability. The men no longer needed to evaluate their behavior or anticipate reaction. They moved from one moment to the next along familiar paths, conserving mental energy by avoiding decisions altogether. Routine became a way to exist without reflection. Over time, this avoidance shaped behavior more deeply. Actions lost connection to outcomes. Tasks were performed because they came next, not because they achieved something. Success and failure blurred. What mattered was completion, not quality. Routine flattened experience into a steady sequence that asked little and offered little in return. Emotion adjusted to this flattening. Without decision, there was less anxiety, but also less engagement. The men did not feel relief. They felt neutrality. Routine dulled emotional edges by removing moments that required judgment. Life became quieter internally, even as it continued outwardly unchanged. Social interaction mirrored this pattern. Conversations shortened. Discussion of alternatives faded. There was little reason to debate or plan when routine already dictated movement. Men synchronized their actions without coordinating their thoughts. Alignment came from repetition rather than agreement. The absence of enforcement reinforced this condition. Without authority intervening, routine faced no challenge. There was no reason to adjust it, question it, or resist it. The guard's distance allowed repetition to continue unchecked, giving routine space to solidify as the primary organizing force of daily life. As days passed, routine began to feel inevitable. Deviating from it required explanation, even though no one demanded one. Stepping outside the familiar sequence felt disruptive, not dangerous, but uncomfortable. Routine had become the default state, and anything else felt like effort. This did not create stagnation immediately. It created efficiency. The men moved through days smoothly, with few interruptions. Yet beneath that smoothness lay a quiet cost. Without decision, there was no sense of progress. Without variation, time lost texture. Days became interchangeable, marked only by repetition. By the end of this phase, routine no longer depended on discipline, authority, or shared belief. It depended on itself. It persisted because it reduced friction. The men did not maintain routine consciously. They inhabited it. Routine carried them forward through days that no longer required obedience, intention, or choice. What had begun as structure imposed from outside had transformed into a self-sustaining pattern. The men were no longer responding to orders or expectations. They were responding to sequence. And in that sequence, life inside the camp continued quietly, guided not by authority, but by the simple fact that routine, once established, is difficult to interrupt. As routine replaced decision, time itself began to change. Days no longer felt distinct from one another. Without moments that required choice, judgment, or reaction, the men experienced time as a continuous flow rather than a sequence of separate events. Morning did not feel like a beginning, and evening did not feel like an ending. Each day simply continued from the one before it. Earlier in captivity, time had been marked by enforcement. Roll calls, inspections, and corrections divided the day into meaningful segments. Later, uncertainty had introduced tension that made hours feel heavy. Now, with routine fully in place and authority distant, those markers dissolved. Time lost its edges. The men no longer anticipated specific moments. They moved through them. This flattening altered attention. Without changes to notice, the mind had little reason to stay alert. Awareness narrowed to the immediate task, then shifted automatically to the next. Reflection became unnecessary. Anticipation faded. The present expanded until it filled the entire experience of the day. The men adapted quickly to this condition, not because it was chosen, but because it required the least effort. Thinking ahead felt pointless when tomorrow would look like today. Looking back felt equally unnecessary. Memory softened, not because it failed, but because it was no longer needed to guide behavior. Routine handled that function. Emotion followed the same path. Strong reactions became rare. Without disruption, there was little to respond to. The men did not feel despair or hope with intensity. They felt steady. This steadiness made endurance possible, but it also removed contrast. Without contrast, time became harder to perceive. Socially, the flattening of time reduced interaction further. Conversation relied on shared reference points, and those points had thinned. When nothing new happened, there was little to discuss. Silence expanded, not as tension, but as default. Men occupied the same spaces without needing to coordinate beyond the routine that already guided them. The guard continued distance reinforced this state. Their presence did not interrupt the flow of days. It blended into it. Authority, once a source of disruption, now passed through without altering rhythm. The men registered it briefly, then returned to sequence. Nothing required adjustment. As weeks passed, the men stopped measuring time in days or weeks. They measured it in cycles. Meals, rest, work, repeat. The cycle mattered more than the calendar. The future lost shape because it promised no variation. The past lost weight because it no longer informed the present. This condition did not feel like captivity in the traditional sense. It felt like suspension. The men were not waiting for change. Waiting requires expectation. They were continuing. Continuation required only repetition. Routine provided that without demanding engagement. By this stage, routine had done more than replace authority. It had replaced progression. Life no longer moved towards something. It moved around itself. The men were not stuck in time. They were embedded in it, carried forward by repetition without destination. This flattening prepared the ground for the next transformation. When time loses texture, behavior follows. Without moments that stand out, effort becomes harder to justify. The men continued to act, but action no longer pointed anywhere. And as routine continued to erase distinction between days, it began to erode something deeper than authority or discipline. It began to erode the sense that what they did mattered in any lasting way, setting the stage for a phase where routine itself would start to feel unnecessary, even as it continued, and where the question would no longer be how to follow it, but why it existed at all. As time flattened, routine began to lose something it had quietly relied on. At first, repetition had offered relief from decision and protection from uncertainty. It simplified the day and reduced strain. But once repetition became total, it no longer served even that function. Routine continued, yet its reason for continuing grew harder to identify. The men still moved through familiar sequences, but the actions no longer felt connected to any outcome. Tasks were completed, not to achieve order or efficiency, but simply because they came next. The link between effort and result weakened further. Doing something well felt no different from doing it adequately. Both led to the same next step in the cycle. This detachment altered motivation. Earlier, routine had reduced effort by removing choice. Now it demanded effort without offering relief. Repetition without meaning became tiring in a different way. The men did not feel overworked. They felt disengaged. Energy was not drained by labor, but by the absence of reason to invest in it. Small signs of this shift appeared gradually. Movement slowed where speed no longer mattered. Care softened where precision no longer changed anything. The men were not resisting routine. They were adapting to its emptiness. When effort produced no distinction, conserving energy became instinctive. Emotion responded quietly. Without purpose, actions no longer generated satisfaction or frustration. The men did not feel disappointed when something went poorly, nor proud when it went smoothly. Reaction flattened. Experience narrowed further, shaped only by what was immediately necessary to continue. Social interaction reflected this narrowing. Men no longer discussed tasks or routines because there was nothing left to evaluate. Everything functioned at a level that required no adjustment. Coordination happened automatically, without conversation. Silence expanded, not as withdrawal, but as efficiency. The guard's continued distance reinforced the sense that routine no longer mattered. Their presence did not restore purpose or urgency. It merely confirmed that appearance was enough. As long as the camp functioned, no deeper engagement was required. Routine existed to sustain continuity, not meaning. Over time, the men stopped expecting anything from routine beyond movement. It no longer organized the day towards stability or control. It simply filled time. The men lived inside a sequence that neither challenged nor supported them. Routine had become neutral background. This neutrality carried a subtle cost. Without purpose, routine could no longer anchor identity. The men no longer felt like participants in an ordered system. They felt like occupants of repetition. What they did not define them. It only passed the hours. By this stage, routine still governed behavior, but it no longer justified itself. It existed because it had always existed. The men did not question it openly, but they no longer relied on it emotionally. It no longer offered comfort or clarity. It merely continued. This loss of purpose marked another turning point. Routine had once replaced authority and decision. Now it stood alone, unsupported by meaning. And when routine loses purpose, it does not collapse immediately. It thins. It becomes something that is followed less carefully, inhabited less fully, and sustained only until something even lighter replaces it. That moment had not yet arrived. The men still moved through the familiar cycle. But beneath that movement, routine had lost its reason to matter, setting the stage for the final phase, when even repetition would no longer feel necessary to endure the day. As routine lost its purpose, it did not disappear. It changed character. What remained was no longer a structure that organized life, but a habit that filled space. The men continued to move through familiar sequences, not because those sequences mattered, but because they required no thought. Routine survived by becoming automatic. At this stage, routine no longer guided behavior consciously. It operated beneath awareness, like a reflex repeated often enough to feel natural. The men did not think about why they lined up or followed certain paths through the camp. They did so because those movements have been repeated too many times to question. Habit replaced intention completely. This shift reduced effort further. Without purpose to justify precision, actions became minimal. Movements were efficient but unengaged. Tasks were completed only to the degree necessary to allow the next moment to arrive. Nothing invited extra attention. Nothing rewarded care. Routine existed to keep the day moving, nothing more. Emotion adjusted accordingly. The men did not feel frustration toward routine, nor did they find comfort in it anymore. It became invisible. When something becomes invisible, it stops influencing how one feels about it. The men lived inside repetition without experiencing it as repetition. Days passed without registering as days. Social life reflected this invisibility. Interaction required little coordination because habit handled alignment automatically. Men moved together without communicating, shared space without shaping one another's behavior, and continued through the day without reinforcing shared meaning. Community existed in proximity rather than engagement. The guard's presence no longer interacted with routine at all. Authority neither reinforced nor disrupted habit. It passed through without leaving an impression. The men no longer adjusted behavior in response to observation because habit did not require adjustment. Routine had become independent of oversight. Time reinforced this independence. The absence of variation made habit stronger, not weaker. Each repetition deepened familiarity, and familiarity reduced awareness. The men were no longer following routine. They were inhabiting it. It carried them forward without asking for participation. By this stage, routine no longer shaped identity or offered stability. It simply occupied the day. The men were not waiting for change, nor resisting it. They existed within a pattern that neither constrained nor supported them. Life continued through motion alone. This condition marked the quiet end of routine as a meaningful force. It had once organized behavior, then replaced decision, then flattened time. Now it had become background motion, detached from purpose and expectation alike. Routine persisted, but it no longer mattered. What remained was endurance stripped of structure. The men continued because continuation required less effort than interruption. Habit allowed survival without engagement. And in that state, routine was no longer a system to follow, but a residue of repetition that filled the days until something else, anything else, gave reason to notice time again. In the end, nothing dramatic marked the moment when routine became the only guide left. There was no collapse, no decision, and no realization shared aloud. Life inside the camp simply continued, carried forward by habits that no longer needed authority, discipline, or belief to sustain them. The men did not feel controlled, and they did not feel free. They existed in a narrow space where movement replaced intention and repetition replaced meaning. Routine asked little and offered little, yet it allowed the days to pass without resistance. What remained was not order, but endurance. The camp still functioned. The structures still stood. Time moved forward, not toward change, but through continuation alone. And in that quiet persistence, the men carried on, not because routine mattered, but because when everything else had faded, routine was all that remained. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.